Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Asian Religion series of the Bright on Buddhism podcast. In this series, we will be discussing religious traditions in Asia other than Buddhism. Buddhism never existed in a vacuum, and as it has spread across all of East Asia, it has developed, localized, and syncretized with local traditions in fascinating and significant ways. As such, we cannot provide a complete picture of East Asian Buddhism without discussing these local traditions such as they are and such as they were. Today we will be continuing our discussion of Shinto, a very historically and culturally significant religious tradition in Japan. If you have not already, please listen to Part 1 and Part 2 of our Asian Religion series on Shinto before listening to this one. We hope you enjoy. We left the story last time at the Meiji Restoration. As we mentioned, in the late Edo period, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Neo-Shinto ideologies had become increasingly popular, and the Tokugawa shogunate was wavering politically and economically. The increased popularity of Shinto is undermining the shogunate because it is a very pro-imperial narrative, and the existence of the Tokugawa shogunate has more or less been predicated upon the emperor of Japan having decreased power and influence. As a result, this resurgent pro-imperial narrative feeds into the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century. The Restoration was so called because they were restoring power over the government of Japan to the emperor, who was named Meiji. This ended nearly 270 years of Tokugawa rule and nearly 230 years of tightly closed borders and legalistically regulated trade, politics, and sumptuary law. The Meiji period, which lasted from 1868 to 1915, is when modern Shinto as we know it today more or less formed. Various scholars even argue that it was during this time period that Shinto, as we know it, was entirely invented. I'm not 100% convinced about that, but they have some good points that we will get into here. Their arguments are that the Meiji state had a vested interest in bringing out a religious tradition that they perceived to be native to Japan and using it to prop up and support the power, legitimacy, and divinity of the emperor. In doing this, they modified and invented ritual traditions, networks of priestly ordination and power, and narratives of Shinto's own history that were all aimed at elevating the emperor. The reason for pushing so hard for elevating the emperor was because of the perceived and the real threats of Western colonial powers, such as England, America, and France. With a strong emperor and with all Japanese people unified behind him, Japan seemed stronger and safer from colonization by these Western powers. The reason Shinto became the pro-imperial religion in question was not that Japanese Buddhism had no pro-imperial narratives or characteristics. Indeed, there's lots of examples of pro-imperial narratives in Buddhism during this time period. Instead, it was that public sentiment had shifted and turned against Buddhism and Buddhist institutions during this time period, as we discussed in the last episode. Buddhism was perceived as archaic, obsolete, and foreign, and thus not suited to the needs of Japanese society in the new and modern world. You'll remember from our other episodes that there was a movement against Buddhism called Haibutsu Kishaku, or Abolish Buddhism, Kill the Buddha, which precipitated during the Meiji period and resulted in the burning of many temples and the disrobing of many monks. These measures and movements were all aimed at orienting Japanese society and the state towards a religious ideology which was perceived to be originally and fundamentally Japanese in nature. This was occurring because the imperialist and expansionist government saw the unity between Christianity and the Western powers, and they saw how that posed a threat to Japan. In other words, there was a lot of anxiety that they too would be colonized by these Western powers and that they would be forced to convert to Christianity. They also saw, however, that religiously fueled expansionism, while very brutal and exploitative for the colonized, was successful economically for the colonizers. Plus, the Japanese Empire had inflamed a long-standing narrative that the Japanese people and culture was inherently benevolent and harmonious compared to the Westerners. Elsewhere on the show, we've talked about the 17-article Constitution, authored by Prince Shotoku in 604 AD, and the first sentence, which outlines the most important rule by which all people must abide, is to value wa, or harmony, among all people. This is why the word wa, meaning harmony, sometimes stands in for the name of the country or the people of Japan. Wafuku means Japanese clothing, but it literally translates to harmonious clothing. Washoku means Japanese food, but translates to harmonious food. So, with this narrative in mind, the Meiji elite made some choices. they decided that they did not want to be on the wrong end of colonization. They witnessed what happened to the Qing dynasty in China with the Opium Wars and the colonial encounter they had. Moreover, they decided that they could do empire in a far more harmonious and less barbaric way. Also, even the Meiji government couldn't deny how much money expansionist colonialism was making for the Western powers. So they saw fit to fight fire with fire by propping up imperial power and expansionism with Shinto, just as European powers propped up their ruling powers with Christianity. They sought to avoid the same fate as the Qing dynasty and the African states and South and Southeast Asia, and preempt being annexed by annexing. Not only was there an economic incentive to expand and create more networks for money and resources to flow from the colonies to the home state, but there was also the military incentive to create a buffer zone of colonial states between the external powers and the nation of Japan itself. Native residents of those colonies be damned. Thus, we will be discussing the Meiji Restoration, the opening of Japan's borders, the subsuming of Shinto under a pro-imperial narrative, and the means by which Shinto was quote-unquote invented, as well as the ways by which it was not. In discussing this, I also aim to make clear the role that Shinto played in the making of the Japanese Empire. The Meiji Restoration and the Meiji period marked a huge turning point for Japanese history at large. One big immediate change is that the borders, which were previously thought to be quote-unquote closed, were quote-unquote unclosed. To be more precise, the governmentally regulated portals through which all foreign trade and exchange were regulated were no longer the only portals that existed. Any coastal city or town was thus able to set up a port and receive trade from people and foreign countries with less governmental oversight and regulation. This was famously the result of what we now call gunboat diplomacy, where I show up to your door with a giant boat full of cannons and guns, and I ask you very nicely to do something, and then you do it, because I have boats with guns. American General Matthew Perry showed up in 1868 with his gunboats and forced open Japan's borders. This border opening led to a sharp increase in foreign exchange with the West and with the rest of Asia. All sorts of new goods and ideas were being imported to Japan and exchanged at a rate that they had never been before. In light of the colonial issues we discussed a moment ago, there was a great deal of anxiety. The Japanese elite felt this need to quote-unquote modernize the Japanese state to catch up with what they perceived to be very modern European and Western states. Again, people saw these highly industrialized Western countries and felt that Japan needed to catch up and fast, or be left behind in obscurity in the best case, colonized and made slaves of Western imperialism at the worst case. So many initiatives to modernize were instituted. Specific to the conversation of Shinto, the government enacted a number of measures to standardize and regulate Shinto under the purview of the emperor. A ministry of the government known as the Jingikan was created with the purpose of regulating all shrine institutions and officials in Japan, and Shinto became the de facto state religion. Under this Jingikan, rituals became overtly state-supporting and state-sponsored, and a new state-sanctioned system for ordaining priests and administering shrines was introduced. State Shinto narratives of history began to be taught in schools in the midst of an initiative to create a state-sponsored and state-regulated education system, and attempts were made all over the country to separate Shinto and Buddhist shrine and temple complexes. So, how does this actually happen? How does the government actually manipulate and invent Shinto into this role as being the religion that props up the emperor? What changes actually take place? Well, one only need look at what existed before and after. Before the Meiji Restoration, most of what is now called Shinto were these disorganized, disparate, and disconnected localized traditions of worship and practice that propitiated gods of weather, of harvest, or of ancestors in a variety of different ways. Central to the ancient state of Yamato, there was the pro-imperial narrative of the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, but that textual tradition and the ritual tradition that extends from it was only known and practiced to the elites living in the environs of the Yamato state, which only existed in the central southern part of Japan. To the east, the west, and the north, there were completely different traditions, completely different pantheons, and completely different rituals that were in no way grouped together and unified. After the Meiji Restoration and the work of the Jingikan, the imperial government was put in control of all priestly ordination all over the country, and the narratives of the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki were emphasized and propagated and taught as the actual history of the entire Japanese state and people. Conflicting narratives were declared supra-religious or superstitious, or otherwise not Shinto. These texts don't mention anybody or anything as far east as present-day Tokyo, and they definitely don't mention anything further north than Tokyo. But in the Meiji period, these narratives started being taught in state-sponsored and regulated schools across the whole country, similar to how creationism was being taught in American schools all over the country at the time. The Shinto narratives depict the emperor as a benevolent living kami, and so it served imperialist purposes to teach this narrative to Japanese children all over the country. This could be only a good thing in the view of the Japanese ruling class because it entailed the light-speed creation of a national network of public schools similar to the public school system of the US. This initiative to educate the entire country while also creating a network of educators that disseminated this state Shinto narrative was called the Great Promulgation Campaign, or in Japanese, the Taikyo Senpu. This narrative not only emphasized the divinity of the emperor, but it also taught that Japan was the land of the kami, or Shinkoku, and that no other place had kami. The position of Ise and Izumo shrines were also elevated to the position of the top of the Shinto imperial hierarchy. It's important to note that there was and is no formal ecumenical structure to the Shinto priesthood, but when I say that Ise and Izumo took on new roles, it's to point out that familial rituals among the imperial family and New Year's ceremonies began to take place there and not at other shrines. The reason why is that Ise Shrine enshrines Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun and the divine ancestor of the imperial family. So the emperor and the imperial family began to do ancestor worship practices there, further cementing the divinity of the imperial line and also expanding the divinity of Amaterasu to encompass all of Japan and all of its people. That's one of the reasons why the Japanese flag during the Asia-Pacific War was a sunrise. One reason is that the first communication from a Japanese emperor to a Chinese one in ancient times had the phrase, "The emperor of the land of the rising sun greets the emperor of the land of the setting sun," referring to the fact that Japan is east of China. So the rising sun has this connotation of up-and-coming Japan, but the flag also is referencing the sun as Amaterasu and the divinity of the imperial family. It's also referring to, in what I would say a not-so-subtle way, the divinity of all the Japanese people. However, although these measures were taking place, the actual process bringing Shinto under the purview of the state was still quite fraught for a few reasons. As we've mentioned before, there was no word in Japanese or Chinese for religion before the colonial encounter. The word and the concept had to be invented in Japanese and Chinese culture, and the characteristics of Western religions were seen as templates for how to understand what made religion and philosophy different from each other. This negotiation was actively being carried out in the midst of not only a strongly nationalist social discourse, but also in the midst of a sharp increase in different kinds of Western learning inside of Japan. For example, modern Western medicine, the theory of evolution, and much more were being brought into Japan in this period, and this information had to be evaluated and weighed against what the Japanese people thought they already knew about the world and about themselves. Many scholars eventually concluded that Western learning had a lot of good points, but it was a heavily biased view of the world, and so Japanese scholars attempted to synthesize it into Japanese learning, which carried the practical considerations of Western geography, science, economics, social science, and more, but carried with it what was perceived to be a uniquely Japanese, a uniquely harmonious perspective and undertone. For example, a Japanese theory of evolution came about that accepted that species change over time, but wholly rejected Darwin's theory of evolution based on survival of the fittest and natural selection. The same was true for ideas such as religion and philosophy. Japanese philosophy as a Western-style scholarly undertaking was born, but at the same time, Japanese people who couldn't decide what Shinto was whenever you sat it down next to Christianity or other Abrahamic religions, whether it was a philosophy or religion, decided that it was both and neither, and that it was superior to any sort of ideology that fell into either of the categories. Religion as a concept, and the specific religions of Japan, were being defined by means of looking to the West as a template, but also by inventing criteria and meaning that suited imperial purposes. Thus, Westernization had a strong influence on how Japan undertook this process of the invention of religion, but there was still a very nationalist and a very imperialist undertone to it all. This process classified what was Shinto and what was super-religious or superstitious nonsense. As I said, the pro-imperial stuff got to be official Shinto, and the other stuff was written off as nonsense. The process of defining Shinto against the other stuff, however, was also difficult. Some of that quote-unquote other stuff was Buddhism. As we've talked about before, Buddhism and Shinto developed together all along the way in Japanese history. There is no Japanese Buddhism without Shinto, no Shinto without Japanese Buddhism. Japanese Buddhism has always had kami in it, and Shinto has always had Buddhist characters in it. Their sacred spaces and their rituals always grew together and took place together. Similarly, sometimes monks and priests of one were also monks or priests of the other at the same time. However, because of all of the anti-Buddhist sentiment mentioned earlier, attempts were made to separate Shinto and Buddhism and define them against each other, obviously with Shinto coming out looking way better in the process. This process was called Shinbutsu Bunri, separating the gods and the Buddhas. This term refers to measures taken by the imperial family and the Meiji government to try and divorce Shinto and Buddhism from each other. Buddhist monks were prohibited from being simultaneously Shinto priests and Buddhist monks at the same time. Buddhist rites were prohibited from taking place on Shinto sacred sites, and vice versa. Buddhist titles for Shinto deities were prohibited from being used. This was an extension of the aforementioned policies which brought priestly ordination standards and procedures for Shinto entirely under the purview of the imperial government. So we have alluded to an expansionist mindset in the Meiji ruling class, and we have talked about how it had political, economic, and military considerations, but we've not yet been specific about the role Shinto played in this, so we will get into that now. With much of the nation of Japan viewing itself as the descendants or subjects of a divine race, two very important concepts entered the scholarly lexicon: Shinkoku and Kokutai. Shinkoku, as I said earlier, means country of the gods, and it actually comes from way earlier in history. Nichiren, who lived in the Kamakura period of Japanese history, is known to have used the term. Nevertheless, it re-enters the conversation when thinking that Japan was a sacred land populated with kami and ruled over by a descendant of those kami. Structurally, the use of this term referred to an imagination that Japan was pure and free of pollutants, such as Western political, scientific, religious, or social ideals, as well as being free from Buddhist thinking, or foreign influences of any kind. The people of this sort of country would collectively be called the Kokutai, or the body politic, the sovereign nation-state of Japan. Because of the perfection and harmony of the Japanese nation-state, it seemed a moral imperative to many thinkers to spread this society and culture to all countries of the world, to create a harmonious Japanese world order with Japanese people and the Japanese emperor as the ruling class. This mindset is what is called Shinto Manifest Destiny. Many imperialists thought that it was the moral responsibility of the Japanese people to invade and conquer the rest of the world and liberate them from the oppressive and inadequate systems in which they were born, and replaced that system and culture with Japanese law, Japanese culture, Japanese learning, Japanese religion, etc. It was, as the most enlightened and harmonious nation-state on earth, the burden of the Japanese to civilize the rest of the world. The first expressions of this Shinto manifest destiny were in the annexation of Hokkaido and the Ryukyu Islands. Hokkaido is the northernmost island of Japan now, and it was not formally a part of the Japanese state until the Meiji era. It has historically been populated by a minority indigenous ethnic group called the Ainu, and they were perceived as uncivilized barbarians, similar to how Native Americans were viewed by the Europeans who first colonized the Americas. The land of Hokkaido was viewed in this very transcendentalist light. It was viewed as the great, untamed, and unperturbed northern wilderness with limitless economic potential and resources. It was either depicted in literature as being empty, completely erasing the Ainu from existence, or as being a land of savages in need of civilization and in need of Japanese assimilation and integration. So, by means of settler colonialism, where people plop themselves down or are plopped down by the government onto land and suddenly claim it as their own, or by means of economic colonialism, where unequal trades are made between two parties until one party has ownership over a great deal of the land and resources of that particular area, Hokkaido was brought within Japanese borders. Homesteaders were sponsored by the Meiji government to go and face down belligerent and savage natives, unforgiving nature, and long odds to create self-sustaining red-blooded Japanese communities, out in this great untamed West, North. You can see the ideology at work here in how the colonization of Hokkaido took place. It was very similar to how colonizing the American West was understood in America. This same process was undertaken around the same time with the Ryukyu Islands, the most well-known of which being Okinawa. Japanese expansionism did not stop there. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War was fought between Japan and the Qing dynasty over control over the Korean peninsula. The war ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ceded Taiwan, the Liaodong Peninsula, and many minor outlying islands to Japanese control. Japan would go on to make war with Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905 and gain control over Manchuria, which is northeastern China, and the Korean peninsula. To the north of Hokkaido, the Sea of Okhotsk, the Sakhalin region of Russia, and far northeastern Siberia were seen to be ripe for the taking as well. And so in 1907, the Japanese government set up a local government structure to rule over the southern part of present-day Sakhalin. This was only the preview for the Asia-Pacific War, or as we know it in the West, World War II, where Japan expanded its empire deep into China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, Russia, and more. Thus, the role of Shinto in Japanese imperialism and expansionism during the early 20th century is made clear. I would like to end by considering the Yasukuni Shrine. I think that the Yasukuni Shrine is one of the most stark expressions of state Shinto as a pro-empire and nationalistic political ideology. Yasukuni means peaceful country, and this shrine is for all of the Japanese war dead. The shrine was founded in 1869 to honor and placate those who had died in the Boshin War, which led to the Meiji Restoration. But the war dead from the two Sino-Japanese wars, from the Russo-Japanese War, and from the Asia-Pacific War are all also enshrined there. Every year, rituals are performed that propitiate and show veneration to Japanese people who died in war or in battle, and all of those war dead have had funeral and memorial ceremonies carried out at that shrine. On the surface, this appears to be quite innocuous. In America, we have the Arlington Cemetery, which also honors all American military dead. However, in America, the military dead's graves are in the shape of crosses, regardless of if they were Christian in life, which highlights the Christian sanctification of the American military, and which plucks some very nationalistic and religious notes. In the same way, the kami of the Yasukuni Shrine are the war dead, regardless of what religion the war dead were before they died. This is very important. The dead are not regular old run-of-the-mill spirits. They don't go to a Christian heaven if they're Christian, they don't go to a Pure Land if they're Buddhist, they don't go to paradise if they're Muslim. They are bona fide kami. As a result, the shrine has faced a great deal of controversy. This controversy has ramped up in the post-war period because Yasukuni enshrines war criminals who committed atrocities that the Japanese government has not ever publicly apologized for. Perpetrators of horrible, horrible acts such as the rape of Nanjing and colonial abuses in the Korean peninsula, and all sorts of other things are enshrined there. Again, I think this is no different from Arlington. There are some truly awful people buried there, and they are not due our respect or veneration. Nevertheless, the controversy pervades. The shrine also faces further controversy because the Prime Minister of Japan makes annual visits to pay his respects, even though the new constitution of Japan that was written and ratified in the post-war period expressly prohibits prime ministers or any government officials from showing any favor to any religion or religious institution. However, because of the ideology that I mentioned before, where Shinto is not viewed as a religion or as a philosophy, but as a superior combination of both that transcends either one, this sort of thing still happens. Personally, I don't think that it's right for war dead, especially war criminals who perpetrated some of the most heinous atrocities that human beings can do to one another, to be thought of in such a divine, holy way. And I think that visiting their grave sites or doing memorial or funeral services is a tool by which ruling elites replicate and propagate nationalistic narratives in the public mindset. I think that this applies to Japanese and American and European and other Asian states as well. And I think that that nationalistic ideology is a tool that political parties and ruling classes can use to advance their own agendas and policies. In so doing, I think that the realities of war and the realities of imperialism and the realities of what it means to actually fight in the military are revised, and these veterans, especially dead ones, are made into these sanctified nationalistic icons, and their real histories and the actual lives that they lived are completely erased, and instead something political and overtly self-serving is inserted into its place. On this very happy note, we are leaving the story at the end of the Asia-Pacific War, with Japan's short-lived land empire, fueled as it was by Shinto pro-imperial narratives, beaten back and defeated. That concludes part 3 of the Asian religion series on Shinto. Join us next time where we will discuss Shinto in the present day, where we will discuss how Shinto is affected not only by the outcome of the war, but also by the shifting role and position of religion in everyday society, and also by the technological and economic advancements and changes of the last 100 years, and, importantly, by westernization. We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.